Okay, so we're going to look at the creation of tombs, and specifically the digging of them, the decoration, how they're organizing the decoration, and then how they're doing it, and how we can trace individual artists. And then the sort of secondary, not so commonly considered question of how are they paying for some of this material and these furnishings particularly. So, Deir el-Medina. We have the village in its two sections. We have the cemetery, which is up on the hillside, with its tomb chapels on the surface, and then shafts leading down to the burial chambers themselves. And on the north side, we have the Hathor chapel, which was constructed in the days of Seti I, later replaced with this large precinct of the Ptolemaic period for Hathor. And I'm going to be doing a episode about Hathor's temple at Dendera soon, so that's why I want to highlight that. Okay. Making the tombs. So the tools that the workers are using, especially the metal ones, those are actually provided by the state. They are distributed to the workers at regular intervals, and then they are collected up again when they become blunt or broken, and they're taken away to specialist like manufactories to be melted down or resharpened or repaired. The Deir el-Medina itself does not have at least not a large metal workshop. They might have small individual crucibles that people are using, but the state itself has, at least based on places like Amana, we know that there were large residences and complexes that seemed to specialize in metalworking. So the state would collect the tools up when they were broken and take them away, repair them with their professional metal workers, and then bring new tools back to Deir el-Medina for the construction of tombs. So, but when it comes to the workers themselves, they are paid regularly, which I discussed in a recent episode. Every 10 days or so, which is the ancient Egyptian week, they get a sack of grain, a large sack. It's something like 30 to 50 liters or something. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a lot, a lot of grain. Now that could by itself provide enough material for you to grind it up and turn it into dough and then make it into bread and feed yourself entirely on bread if you wanted to. But it seems like from the written material that the workers are using a large portion of this grain to trade. They're trading for the other things that they need, which they don't necessarily get directly from the state. Based on the deliveries of goods, they're not getting a lot of meat in the regular deliveries. That only comes in on special occasions like a festival. So chances are to get their protein needs, they are trading amongst themselves or with farmers down near the river to get what they need to supplement their diet, to supplement their household, and to pay for the other things they need. So it is fundamentally a barter economy, but there is the way that they're recording it and the way they're acting, there is something like a sort of proto marketplace, I guess you might call it. It's not as sophisticated in terms of financials as we would consider a market today. And that's quite a thorny issue in sort of economic scholarship as to how do you define a market when you don't have, currency. They're still doing similar behaviors, but they're not necessarily thinking about it in the same way we would. And that's all sort of a nebulous way of saying that they're getting paid in a very raw material and in certain tools are being provided. But then amongst themselves, they are trading regularly to get what they need. And that includes the tombs that they're building. So when a royal tomb is under construction, I only get this cough when I'm doing a live stream or a lecture. Something about talking live seems to bring it out. Richard says, refresh your page. For another person. So I've lost my train of thought. Right. So when they're building a royal tomb, they're digging a corridor, straight down through the bedrock, but that corridor is relatively narrow. Maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 men can stand side by side and hammer away at the walls. But the village itself probably has 20, 30 builders who are capable of doing that work. So if you can only have 4 men working on the corridor at once, digging through, how are you organizing the other 25 or 26 men? Maybe you have them working in groups, 4 at once, and they dig for an hour, and then they swap for the next 4, and they're sort of rotating. Maybe that's one way of doing it. But no matter how well you organize that, you've always got about 20 people who are relatively idle compared to what they could be doing. So those other 20 people are not on site in the Valley of the Kings every single day, every single hour. They seem to be rotating on a fairly regular basis. Some of them are going to be working on the tombs of the Queen over in the Valley of the Queens, and I'll be introducing the Valley of the Queens in an upcoming episode. Some of them are working on the tombs of nobles, like the high-ranking courtiers of the king. They can pay for their own tombs, or the king gives them permission to build in the Theban necropolis. That also requires the same type of work. So the workforce is probably at any one time distributed across the west bank of Waset or Thebes to work on these monuments. But even then, you're still going to have maybe 4 or 5 or 6 who on any given day are idle. They're not necessarily required at any particular construction site. That's the time when these men are primarily working on their tombs. So they're chipping away at them literally now and again over the course of years. And they're using the same tools that they used to build the royal tombs, and they're using the same or similar decorative schemes as well, as we will see in just a moment. But this is when they're primarily doing the work, is like on their weekend, in their evenings, or on their days off when they don't have other tasks. Now, the tombs that they build can become quite elaborate, but one thing to remember when we look at them is that we're seeing the tombs in their final state. So, for example, a tomb like this, Theban Tomb 1, which is the tomb of Sennedjem, it's got multiple chambers sort of coming down, but it's been expanded over time. They start with the shaft and one chamber, and they get that mostly done in case that needs to be the burial chamber. Then, if they feel confident, they carry on down to the next. They open up a staircase and they start the next chamber. And then that serves as the potential burial chamber. And then if that's finished and Sennedjem is still hale and healthy, they would open up another shaft or staircase to go down to the next chamber as well. So the tombs are expanding over time according to circumstance. And we'll see, some of the tombs are relatively simple, like this tomb belonging to an artist. It's just it's mainly a straight passage corridor down and then a single chamber with a side chamber. But compared to Sennedjem here, which goes down and down and down and off and up, this one is architecturally relatively simple. And maybe that's not surprising because this chap, Pashed or Pashedu, he wasn't a builder, he was an artist. So maybe the major concern wasn't so much the complexity of the chambers, but the space for decoration and the space for him to do his work. Or maybe this was all he could afford to pay a builder to do on his behalf. But then you have a tomb like Theban Tomb 292, which has multiple chambers branching off. And that's because many of these tombs are family tombs. They are expanding over generations. When they first construct them, it maybe has 1, 2, or maybe 3 chambers for the original owner. but then they start adding to it. His son adds a series of chambers. His son adds a series of chambers. And you wind up with these sort of rabbit warren tombs going into the hillside. But just sort of going back to the question of how are they building them, and, you know, how is this all being organized? The first thing to remember is that they're expanding slowly over time. So they're not singular projects. They're not planning out a single monument and then constructing it. They are adding little bits as they go, according to a possibility. And then the second thing is that they're mainly working on this in their spare time, and they're paying each other to do the work that they can't do. So, as I said, Pashedu, he was an artist, but he wasn't a builder. So he would be paying a builder to do this job, this construction part for him. He can then decorate it himself because he has that skill. By comparison, Sennedjem, he is a builder, and he's able to do quite an elaborate construction for himself, but he's not a decorator, he's not a painter. So he's paying somebody else to do that for him. And we'll come back to in a minute as to who that person actually was, because we do have an idea. So these are some of the tools that they're using. From the tomb of Ka in the 18th dynasty, we have beautiful wood and bronze like adzes or hoes that they're using to dig out the rock, like chip away at the limestone. We also have these wooden mallets, which they're using with chisels. And you can see the wooden mallet itself has been slowly worn down by repeated striking on the end of the chisel. It's, you know, kind of worked its way in. And if we go quickly back to that thing, it's basically the exact same style as this chap was using. And here's an ostracon, which I referenced in the episode about making Seti I's tomb. It shows a group of artisans actually working on a burial hall. In this particular case, they seem to be opening up a passage, a corridor, with a doorway here. Here's the lintel. Here's the like one side of the door, the other side, and there's the actual opening. So obviously it's drawn in horizontal profile. And then we have the staircase with the steps and the ramp in the middle. Most, not all, but many like temples will have a ramp in the middle for the sled to be drawn on it, like carrying the sarcophagus, that kind of thing. But some tombs will also have it for bringing down the sarcophagus or the larger grave goods. So this is a very common motif that you see in their building of staircases. You have the little chaps here sitting on a bench, which looks like they've kind of rigged up a trestle style, like two little stands and then a plank of wood, and they're sitting on it to hammer away with their little mallets and chisels. And then below them, you have a group of men carrying away goods, or possibly bringing them in. It's a bit hard to say depending on the context. And you have another group down here who are carrying goods. They are either removing the rubble or they are bringing in tomb goods, like or material for the building, like plaster for applying to the walls. It could be either one. But these kind of little visual representations give us an idea of how they're thinking about it in terms of the process. And it also gives us a nice little sort of encapsulation of the confined space and the restricted number of workmen. Obviously, it's just a piece of art, so it's not like a photograph, but you have, you know, two men working on the wall and 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 men carrying things, like bringing away material or bringing in supplies. So, you know, not taking it literally, but it does give you a sort of idea of the distribution of work within the actual project. So let's quickly touch on decoration, because most of the artists at Deir el-Medina, most of the workers at Deir el-Medina are not artists. If the workforce has about 68 people in the time of Seti I, only about 6 or 8 of those are professional artists, at least as far as we can tell from the records. And notably, in the early 19th dynasty, most of the artists that we know about belong to just two families. There are two clearly identifiable clans who are all professional artists or draftsmen, and those are the main ones that we know about in the time of Seti I and early Ramesses II. So that's quite a small group, all things considered. Just two families are monopolizing the workforce or the available work for the decoration of tombs. Now, on the other hand, that does actually have its advantages, because those families and those professional artists, naturally, they decorated their own tombs. And if we can identify from their tombs the particular style that they're using, the way they draw certain features or the way they plan certain scenes, scholars can perhaps tentatively identify which individual artist is doing what particular style, and then trace that through other monuments, including the tombs of Deir el-Medina and perhaps even the royal ones. And there's been some interesting scholarship about this over the past few years, and also in the early 1990s, that I wanted to touch on. So let's look at that a little bit. First of all, here's a really wonderful artist from the 18th dynasty specifically. This is a depiction of Menkaperra, or Thutmose III. This is an artist's kind of draft board, like their palette, if you will. And normally it would be just this kind of smooth wood. But on this side, they've laid down a sketch, their draft sketch of a scene for the king. In context, it's probably a scene from a tomb, potentially a temple, but it shows the king enthroned upon his seat. And the key things here to take away are the grid on which the scene is laid. The artist lays down the grid first by using red string, and then all of the proportions of the scene are very carefully measured out. So, for example, the baseline starts here with the top of the plinth or the dais on which he sits. And then the width of the dais is 3/4 of a square. It's not like, I'm sure if you measured it, millimeter by millimeter, it's probably not exactly, but it seems that that's the dimension he's going for. But then the seat itself is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to reach just to the top. And again, slightly goes over the line, but for the most part, it seems to adhere to that. And then the body itself carries on, usually from the hip layer, or in this case, the buttocks, up to the top of the shoulder. And that's another sort of measuring point. And then the head itself only takes up like 3 squares on this particular scheme. These essentially are the models that we see in classical, typical Egyptian art. The grid system does change during the Amarna period, as I'm sure enthusiasts among you will know. Akhenaten adds because he makes figures more elongated and slender and curvy, that changes how the body proportions are conveyed on the grid system. But records like this, which is now in the British Museum, basically show the principles of this art in action. But on the other side, somebody has erased whatever scene was there. It might have just been empty, and they've been doing practice arms. Now, you'll notice that the arms here are very rough. Like, look, the thumbs are extremely long, tapering, slender. This one is horribly misshapen. So it seems like somebody, perhaps an apprentice, maybe a son, is practicing their arms here. But you compare that to the arms of the actual figure over here, and it's night and day in terms of the cleanliness of the lines, the elegance of the curvature. This chap is obviously just starting out, just learning. But then you also have a quail chick, the hieroglyph for W or Wu, and that's a bit more elegant. It's got the way the legs are drawn is far less stiff than these arms are. much more curvature, small detailing on the feathering. It seems like we have the work of a couple of artists here at once who are doing their particular style. Just a couple of close-ups to give a sense of how the artist has even distinguished the little horizontal stripes within the king's beard, the horizontal layers of his wig, and the snake curving around the headband to emerge from his forehead. The snake disappears when it goes behind the headband. Just nice little details like that, along with the small vertical lines that go at the top of the men hieroglyph. The actual hieroglyph itself is like a board game, and these are the little pieces on top of it, and the artist has distinguished them. Notably, there's fewer vertical lines here than here, and the scarabs are also of different style and quality, along with the hands. So, maybe we have one artist doing this cartouche and another artist doing this particular cartouche. But the reason I'm highlighting these is that these little details, like the detailing in the beard, the way the eye is drawn, the smaller features on the hieroglyphs, or simply the curve, the sort of style of how the arm is drawn, those are things that art historians or Egyptologists specializing in this kind of work use to try to pinpoint differences between individual artists. They're very much like fingerprints, if you will. Same just close up on the bird and the arms, just giving you a sense of the differences in quality. I quite like this thumb. Like, I would really like to know what happened there exactly. At what point did the artist think maybe this thumb is getting too long, and we've committed. But I quite like that. That's fun. But then you have this kind of stuff, which is night and day compared to the amateur work that we just saw. So this is another scene from the tomb of Sennedjem. It is a scene from the Book of the Dead, in which the deceased requests that the sky goddess Nut give breath and water, essentially nourishment and life, to the deceased to help them move to the next world. I highlighted it in the previous live stream because it has a cool feature where the goddess herself is merged with and emerging from the tree, and her feet are part of the roots, which is a really cool visual style. It's just a beautiful scene, but it kind of gives us a nice emphasis on how the quality of this art can be. This is from another scene, a tomb belonging to Ipoi, who was an artist, and his wife Dua Emberes. And it probably has a scene from the festival known as the Beautiful Festival of the Valley, which I'll be talking about on the next narrative episode in more detail. But it's roughly equivalent to the ancient Egyptian Day of the Dead, if you will, in which, at least in Waset, in Thebes, the people would go to the western bank to present offerings to their ancestors and to take gifts for those who came before. And a very big component of the Beautiful Feast of the Valley was presenting flowers. Not entirely clear why flowers specifically, but they do offer, food and things like that. But flowers are a very big motif in the Festival of the Valley. It's quite interesting. This piece of art is also nice because it has a slightly strange-looking cat and a little kitten hanging out with the deceased. Lovely little details from this particular tomb. Okay, so as I was alluding to with that drawing board we saw earlier, we can identify some of the visual elements that a particular artist might use in their style. So this next section is particularly based on the work of a scholar named Gemma Menendez and an earlier scholar named C. Keller. And they've done sort of a lot of the work in terms of studying the finer details of Deir el-Medina art in order to identify the particular styles that individual artists have. If you've ever done, drawing or art for any length of time, you may find that there are just certain ways that you feel comfortable, that you like drawing certain things. Maybe if you try to draw a face, you particularly like drawing the eye in a certain way, or the ear in a certain style, or mouth, nose, lips, etc. The ancient Egyptian artists are no different. They have certain characteristics in the way they draw certain features. So, for example, in the tomb of Sennedjem, or TT1. Scholars like Menendez have identified at least 2 artists working on the walls. Now, one of them, called Artist 1, is very, very clearly identifiable through a few features. Firstly is the nose. This particular artist always draws the nose in a sort of prominent hook kind of style, with a slightly rounded shape. It appears here and here and here. They always draw the eye with this kind of almond shape, but slightly wide. You know, it's not too narrow. It's a little bit wider. The facial expression is always kind of flat, somber, not particularly expressive in terms of the facial detailing. And the corner of the mouth always goes down like this. Down here, down here, down here, down here. This is the way this particular artist likes to do it. By contrast, we have artist number 2 in the same tomb. They have much more elongated eyes. If we go back, see this one's relatively wide, you know, more compressed. This one is long, like really stretched. The mouth is often upturned in a smiling expression. You can see it. It's harder to see here. It's a bit low res, but you can get it here. It's just a bit more cheerful overall. Go back here. Relatively flat, somber, almost like that the meme of the cat who's just like that. But this one, the second artist, is quite cheerful. And overall, I think this last point is a little bit is quite subjective, but you compare the style of these details and figures. This artist seems to be a little bit more precise, a little bit more refined. I don't like to use that word. It implies quality, but just a little bit cleaner compared to this one, who seems to be a little bit rougher, especially with the sort of finer details like the hands. Menendez suggests that maybe this one, the second artist, is the apprentice of artist number 1, a little bit less experienced, a little bit less precise in their detailing. That one's a bit more subjective, but it's, you know, that is possible. Possibly a third artist, or maybe artist number 2 again, working on some of the smaller items, like this one belonged to Sennedjem's son, Karbeknet, and his wife, Waset. Similar details to artist number 2, although it's hard to see here, but you've got the more upturned mouth, kind of with a smiling expression. You have an somewhat elongated eye, although not as extreme as artist 2. And very distinctively, if we go back, artist number 1 fills the eye up with a full circle. Artist number 2 does the same. Artist number 3 leaves a white gap, almost like they're looking slightly up, kind of glancing forward. Doesn't do it with the Waset eyes at the top, but does it with the human eyes here. Not entirely sure why, but that could be another indicator that this is a third artist, maybe somebody who's specializing in decorating objects rather than walls. But these are the little visual signifiers that can help to identify individual artists. Here's artist number 1 back on the wall of Sennedjem's tomb, showing them cutting wheat in the field of reeds in the afterlife. A couple of little, the same signifiers appear even in the hieroglyphs. For example, and this is the wife's name, Neferti. Neferti. But the way they draw the snake is almost like you might draw a cartoon like seagull off in the distance, like just a little flick. But they seem to do it every time with their serpents. And that's not the case with all of the serpents on the same wall. Sometimes they have different markers. So you can even perhaps identify it in the hieroglyphs. The same thing outside of the individual tombs at Deir el-Medina themselves, scholars can possibly trace the same artists working in the royal tombs. And this is probably the the one that's most interesting to the casual audience is, who's actually decorating like the tomb of Seti I or the tomb of Nefertari? Who's actually doing that? Well, obviously they're the artists who are coming from Deir el-Medina because they're building the tombs. But scholars can go further and sort of begin to trace individuals who are doing particular scenes. So, for example, in Sennedjem's tomb, the artist has a very distinctive style of drawing knees. Now, knees are not something that I normally think about, and I know why. It's because most artistic scenes, they're not showing the knees. They are covered over with these long kilts, at least for the time period I specialize in, which is the late 18th and early 19th. But when they do show knees, this particular artist kind of draws them almost like ears attached to the front of the leg. If you think of this as like being the head, this is kind of like an ear with the lobe coming down here. Very distinctive style. Shows up here in the tomb of Sennedjem itself. But then we have the exact same knees in the tomb of, this is in one of the unfinished chambers in Seti's tomb, just off from the pillared hall. The same artist was decorating both of these because they have a very distinctive way of doing the knees. Notably, there are differences. The knees here have these pronounced lines going in, but here it doesn't. Similarly here, this one doesn't do that. This one does, which maybe raises the suggestion that that individual figures are being drawn by individual artists, working side by side. But they each have their own little way of doing knees. And that kind of comes across in the art, which perhaps allows scholars to trace these individuals. Similar thing happens with feet. The style of drawing feet in some tombs is quite similar to the ones that we find in royal tombs, for example, Nefertari. This one, I'm a little bit skeptical on the comparison, to be perfectly honest. But the study that I read by Menendez suggests that the way this artist has drawn these particular feet with the toenails is quite similar. I'm not entirely convinced on that, simply because I think these particular feet look quite a bit different from these ones. That's not to say they're wrong by any stretch. Just at least in this particular example, I struggle to see it a little bit. But maybe if anyone sees something in here that does seem like quite a striking similarity, I'd love to hear it. But it's worth talking about because we often focus on this sort of the eyes, the face, the beautiful design of the clothing, but feet have their own distinctive markers as well that maybe give clues to who the artists are. And in this particular case, it's important because a tomb like Ipoi, he is one of the artists. He's a member of those families of artists. So if Menendez was right that these are drawn by similar artists, then perhaps Ipoi did some of the work on Nefertari's tomb. Patty says that the angle of the toenails are different, particularly the bottom ones are horizontal. I agree. These ones, you can see they're more on a flat line, whereas here in Ipoi's tomb, they're much more sort of diagonal. But, there are other scenes in the tombs. Maybe I'm just missing what Menendez comparison, but we'll see. At least here, there's a lot stronger argument in my view when it comes to the faces. Maybe I'm just more of a face person than a foot person. But when you look at the shape of the eye, the shape of the mouth, in particular the shape of the lips, but also this very distinctive downturn on the side, which is shadowy here, like it's been covered over by the paint, but you can still get the ghost of it coming off here. And the way the neck folds are treated, that does seem like a much stronger comparison to me as the same artist, or at least an artist working in the same tradition. Again, the hands are different, so I don't think it's a perfect one-to-one. But it's possible that one artist is doing the face and then somebody else is doing the body. We can't rule that out. But this is a much stronger comparison in my view, that to say, okay, maybe Epoi did work on the tomb of Nefertari. We get a similar thing when it comes to the subject matter itself. So some of the tombs include scenes that are directly copied from royal tombs. So this is quite a famous image from the tomb of Nefertari, which shows it's Ra, but it's in his underworld nighttime form, where he often appears as a ram, and he's attended by Nebet-Hut and Aset together. But basically the same scene appears in one of the Deir el-Medina tombs as well, in what you would say is a much rougher style, much more like, look at the Nebet-Hut here. Beautiful, nice, straight here, angular off. But to be fair, this particular scene is painted on a much rougher surface. You know, the walls have not been smoothed down nearly as much here. We'll give them a break. The artist is doing their best within the circumstances. But it is possible that they're basically, as they're working on these royal tombs, occasionally they might be doing a scene and decide that they quite like that, and they add it to their own tomb. Generally speaking, the subject matter between a royal tomb and a non-royal tomb is usually very different. The royal tombs are what you would call very formal, not communicating a lot of personality in terms of the deceased. The royal tomb is serving a very strict and important religious function for the preservation of a divine being, you know, the king or the queen. And the preservation of that divine being is leagues more important than your average commoner. So the royals don't really get as much choice in terms of how their tombs are decorated, and certainly much less variety. But the tombs of the non-royals have a lot less of this formal stuff. So when it does show up, it's quite distinctive. And unfortunately, this particular photograph is from the 1920s, so it's just terrible quality. So we can't make any stylistic comparisons. But at least from the rough style, you get a similar sense of proportion with the body. That's like protruding stomach and bottom. Similar curvatures on the female forms. We would need to see a high resolution photo of the actual tomb itself to make any proper comparisons. But it's not outside of the question that whoever worked on this particular scene adapted it, or adapted a form of it for their own tomb. Although that being said, the wigs on the goddesses are different. These ones have the bag headdresses. These ones have the more straightforward classic wig. But it's not impossible. Okay, this one I'm going to touch on very quickly because I want to dive deeper into the pod. But it is just a fun little motif to mention briefly. So as I said, people like Sennedjem, they are builders. They're artists. They're not scribes. And somebody like Sennedjem is probably at best like partially literate. Maybe not even that. It's not a building work requires a great deal more practical knowledge than written knowledge. And I don't mean that as a, disparagement. Very different skills. Sennedjem probably wasn't that versed in hieroglyphs. He could probably write his name. He could probably write a few basic phrases or maybe the words of certain things. But he almost certainly couldn't read complex sentences or texts. And the reason we know that is because in his tomb, he has a chapter from the Book of the Dead. It appears around this scene. Unfortunately, when I was photographing it, I didn't think to get the end of it, I didn't think to get the whole thing, which I regret now. But the key thing here is that this Book of the Dead, which starts behind this metal frame, carries on here column by column by column with the various invocations. And then right down the bottom, it just stops in mid-sentence. And it doesn't continue. It doesn't pick up anywhere else. Whoever was writing the Book of the Dead on the wall ran out of space at the end and didn't fix it, or couldn't fix it. And which is interesting because clearly they're not too worried about the hieroglyphs and the next scene overlapping. Like they've got this section that cuts into the hieroglyphs hieroglyph section, and the hieroglyphs have been drawn around it, suggesting that the hieroglyph text was done afterwards. So clearly they're not too fussed about overlapping. So there is space for them to at least finish the sentence. That would have been possible, but they didn't, which suggests tentatively that Sennedjem couldn't actually read what was going onto the wall. He was relying on the scribe or the artist to put the text down correctly. Maybe the artist is working from a scroll, they're copying it, they're not necessarily doing it by memory. But when something happens like the scribe finishes at the bottom of the wall in the middle of a sentence and they can't complete it, Sennedjem doesn't seem to have the knowledge to request that they quickly finish off at least that sentence just to get the effect. So that tells us something a little bit about the literacy level of the individual workers. An artist or a writer is literate, but a builder like Sennedjem is not, and you can sort of trace that in their tombs. Again, I'll come back to that in a future episode, because it's I'd like to talk more about the texts in Sennedjem's tomb, but now is not the time. So now let me quickly run through sort of how you pay for all of this. So in the days of Seti I and Ramesses II, we do have a few records or receipts from people paying for particular tomb goods, like the coffins or the furnishings that would go into their tomb. And we can roughly work out the value of those things economically. So for example, the inner coffin or a mummy board that goes over the body, that would cost about 40 deben, or about 3.6 kilograms of copper. And that's just for the coffin itself. You would pay an additional 3 deben, or an additional 10%, to decorate it. A wooden bed is half the price of a coffin. It's only 20 deben, or 1.8 kilograms. And a wooden door is slightly cheaper as well, which is 16 deben, or 1.4 kilograms. And we know that artists like Sennedjem had those wooden doors. Sennedjem had a nice coffin. He could somehow afford to pay for these things, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, we can't compare the raw value. We can't take 3.6 kilograms of copper and just figure out how much would that cost today, because the value of copper and the price of copper is much lower in modern industrialized societies than it was in the ancient world. Half of the machinery that I'm using to share this information with you has a great deal of copper running through it. Copper is dirt cheap today. For the ancient Egyptians, it was much rarer. You had to go into the Sinai Peninsula or the Eastern Hills in order to acquire it. The mining country was dangerous. It was difficult. Copper was a lot more valuable. So we can't compare that value at a raw level, but we can figure out how much they earned every month and roughly compare that to the price of items. So we can at least figure out the relative value. So in the Ramessid era, around Seti I and Ramesses II, somebody like Sennedjem would earn 5.5 sacks of grain every month. That was the base payment that came to them from the government. Now, the value of those 5.5 sacks of grain is approximately 11 deben, or 11 deben of copper. So if we think about that in terms of the price of items, a coffin, which is 40 deben, that's actually about 4 months of a worker's income. Assuming that worker did not eat, did not buy anything else for 4 months, then they could afford one of these coffins. And even something like a wooden door, which Sennedjem had on his tomb, that represents about 6 weeks of income. And then you bear in mind that many of these people, like Sennedjem, they have multiple coffins. He has the inner one, which is 40, and he has the outer, which I haven't included the price here. And then he has the door. He's spending, upwards of 2 years worth of income in order to pay for all of these goods, along with all the other things he had in his tomb. Which, again, I'll come back to in the podcast, because we have, it's an interesting question as to how are they affording these? Are they individually wealthy? Do their families own land elsewhere that they can afford to draw on? I think the more likely explanation is that when they are doing work for artists, not artists, aristocrats, like when they're building nobles' tombs, they are probably negotiating prices for themselves. We'll take time off from the royal tomb to do this tomb for you, Mr. High Priest, but you're going to have to negotiate a good price for us because we have other jobs to do. So that would be one way that they're supplementing their income, is with basically private contracts. Another way they might be doing it is if they're trading with each other. Maybe somebody wants you to do a job that is not equivalent in terms of bartering. Like if a builder asks somebody to dig his tomb and to paint his tomb, and he offers to dig their tomb in return, maybe the price is not equivalent. So they're laying out money as well on the side. So maybe somebody like Sennedjem could save up money to eventually afford these nice things. But I would suspect that the main one is from private contracts for the rich. But anyway, if you come back to the sort of the basic salary that they're getting every month, it seems like life at Deir el-Medina was not the cheapest, if you really sort of break it down. So a liter of cooking oil was about 1 deben in value. And that seems to be like a sort of similar to like a castor oil today. And then something as simple as like a tunic is 5 deben. So that's almost half of your month's salary for a single kilt. Now, to be fair, most of what they're using, well, I should say, in 21st century society, so much of our clothing or the items we use regularly they're now designed to be, or intentionally manufactured to become obsolete or to be replaceable. Throwaway society is the casual term. The ancient Egyptians are making things to last. You're buying that tunic for 5 deben, but that tunic is probably going to be made well enough to last you for several years. So it's not the equivalent of buying a cheap t-shirt, today. They are much better quality makes, and they are designed to last, and you're buying much fewer of them. Somebody like Sennedjem doesn't have 10 t-shirts or 10 kilts in his wardrobe. He probably has 2 or 3 maximum. So it's important to remember that the way we treat commodities like these in the modern world is terribly wasteful and has become, but more fundamentally, has become a lot more devalued compared to the ancient world. But you still get a sense of sort of the relative value of things from how much they're paying. So a metal razor is like 1 deben, maybe 2 deben. Again, that's going to last you quite a while. It's not a disposable razor. It's a small metal one that is actually going to last and just needs to be sharpened occasionally. A small wooden box, relatively simple, maybe 1 or 2 deben. But again, it's not like buying a piece of Tupperware. It's going to last you potentially years. A linen sheet, meanwhile, that's almost an entire month's salary for the price. Now, bear in mind that all of this linen has to be woven by hand. These are not easy things to make. They're not cheap items to make. So that kind of gives you a sense of where the true value lies in the difficulty of the work, the skill of the work. It's much harder and more time-consuming to weave an entire sheet of linen than it is to make a small wooden box, which, a lot of the raw material is just wood. By comparison, a chair is more than a month's wages, or even 2 months' wages. But a sheep or a goat, less than a third of your month's wages. A donkey, that's at least 2.5 months. And that partly comes down to the fact that the donkey is supposed to work for years. They're supposed to be bringing value into your household. It's like buying a car so that you can work as an Uber driver. It's supposed to pay itself off through the work that you do. So we do actually have enough information to get a sense of relative value in these communities. And what are the things that are actually expensive and what do they value? Something like Shabti figurines are quite cheap, apparently. We only have one receipt from them from the 20th dynasty, where somebody was paying one deben, one copper weight for 40 shabtis. I'm going to assume that that is something like these middle ones, which are very low quality. You can buy shabtis like this from a million dealers in Egypt today. And if you're not experienced, they're very hard to distinguish from something that is authentic. So you can see some of these are quite rough, and those are probably quite cheap. You do have your expensive ones, like this Amana period shabti, which is made of wood, so more expensive, but also just much better manufacture compared to this little chap. I quite like this little chap, but you get the idea of, a shabti is not a shabti is not a shabti. They do come in different styles and qualities, and some of them are very cheap as they are today. But then you have a wooden bed, like from the tomb of Ka, which represents, 2 months of a normal worker's wages. Similar with a chair. And going back to the wooden box, I mentioned how the wooden boxes are generally quite cheap. We do have records for expensive ones, which presumably are the higher quality or the larger ones with fancy detailing and decoration. Something quite simple, just untreated wood, maybe a little monogram on it, and the hinges to open it up, maybe that's a couple of deben. Still not cheap, If you think of your monthly salary, let's say what's the average monthly salary in the US? Like, let's say you earn $5,000 a month, approximately. I don't know. That would be the equivalent of spending 1,000 on just a box. They're not cheap, but they do come in relative qualities and costs. But then somebody like Sennedjem, his wife, he has a set of coffins. His wife has a set of. His son has a set of coffins. His other son has a set of coffins. Clearly this family was doing very well for themselves, and they were able to ultimately afford to lay out many months worth of income on these particular items. But this kind of gives you a sense of how I've highlighted this coffin to emphasize the fact that, they're incredibly intricate in their decoration, and they're not perfectly made. You look at the sort of the lines on the coffin, the wig is not even, the face is a little bit crooked. They're still not working at like the royal level of artisanship, which is fine. You don't need Tutankhamun level quality. But when we're thinking about the relative cost and expense of these things, it's always good to remember, how much, what you actually get for your money. Somebody like Sennedjem is laying out a lot of money for these, and he's getting excellent quality. But there's still, even then, the Deir el-Medina workers are still operating at a level significantly lower than what the royals are getting. There's a big divide between even a well-off community and what the pharaohs are actually able to afford. And it's always worth remembering that when we're thinking about the relative inequality and wealth of their society. Even the professional middle class are substantially lower in terms of what they can afford. We do have written texts that actually describe some of these transactions. Most of them come from the 20th dynasty, so I'll do an episode about those at the appropriate time. But at least one from the 13th century BCE mentions a draftsman paying an artist or an artisan for a coffin. The draftsman, Neferhotep, gives a painted stela like this. And in return, he gets a wooden coffin, let's say something like this one. And then he also decorates 2 coffins, and in exchange, he gets a bed. Now, that might sound strange, one painted stela, and in return, you get a coffin. Key thing to remember is that stone is still quite expensive and also requires more skill in the fine working of the hieroglyphs and the painting. So even though at a glance or in a modern eye, this might seem like it's worth more than this, in terms of the available skills, the available materials, they're actually closer in what you might expect. I'm not saying that this particular stela is worth the same as a coffin, might have been a larger stela, but just as an example, like we can't make a direct one-to-one comparisons based solely on what we think it's worth. This has its own value, which is very, very hard to produce. This is a reconstruction of a funeral from National Geographic. As I've mentioned before, I think reproductions like this, they often come from the tomb scenes of very wealthy individuals. So I think sometimes they oversell the raw splendor of them or pageantry, but it at least gives you an idea of what maybe somebody like Sennedjem got on the day of his funeral. If we imagine his coffin is a little bit less ornate, maybe these shrines are communal use ones rather than personalized, that kind of thing. We at least maybe get an idea of relative splendor. But so that's broadly speaking just a little bit about the cost of these tombs and how they're actually producing them on their own. As I said, there are certain aspects like the Book of the Dead of Sennedjem that I want to get into more in the narrative. But broadly speaking, this is how they seem to be paying for them and how they seem to be decorating them. The artists are decorating the tombs of the builders, and the builders are building the tombs of the artists. On their days off, when they're not actually working at the tomb, they're probably doing private contracting for wealthy or powerful individuals, and they're also working on their own tomb or the tombs of others.